Fairfax County Public Library welcomes customers. We expect all our visitors to be respectful of our neighbors, staff, and facilities and engage in activities associated with the use of the library, some of which include disruptive behavior, harassing, threatening, or intimidated language or behavior. The order of the meeting is as follows. First, I will begin by introducing our moderator and speaker. Shortly afterwards, the discussion will begin. As the discussion takes place, feel free to raise your virtual hand on Zoom using the hand raising function. At this time, you can unmute yourself and ask a question of our speaker, Margaret Myers. You'll see it, it's under the participant screen. It's a little yellow or orange little hand. So you ask the questions of our speaker, Mrs. Myers. Afterwards, Mrs. Myers will continue speaking and taking audience input as we go along. After she wraps up, we will take any additional questions, and at roughly 4 p.m. we will conclude the event. So without further ado, let me introduce Mike Carpenter, our moderator, and Ms. Myers, our guest speaker who established the dialogue, the Dialogues China and Latin America Working Group in 2011 to examine China's growing presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Is everyone set?
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you, David, very much for once again getting another great decision session underway. We all appreciate it and appreciate all the work that the library does for this program. As we all know, COVID-19 had knocked our plans for 2020 sort of into a hat, but here at the end of the year, we're doubling up to get through as many of the issues and topics that we were to have discussed. Before we get to today's discussion, I just wanted to say that on December the 4th, we're going to be having another session on panic at the border, U.S. relations with the Northern Triangle. That's with El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And then on the 18th of December, we'll wrap up the year with our final topic, America's uneven approach to artificial intelligence and its consequences. So do get those dates onto your calendars, and the articles and the videos will be coming out to you shortly.
Michelle?
But today, our topic is competition for influence,
okay, that's right.
China and Latin America. And our guest discussant today is Margaret Myers from the Inter-American Dialogue. The Inter-American Dialogue engages a network of global leaders and to foster democratic governance, prosperity, and social equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Together, they shape policy debate, devise solutions, and enhance cooperation within the Western Hemisphere. Ms. Myers is the director of the Asian and Latin American program at the Dialogue. She established the Dialogue's China and Latin America Working Group in 2011 to examine China's growing presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. She also helped develop the China-Latin America Finance Database, the only publicly available source of empirical data on Chinese state lending in Latin America. Ms. Myers has published numerous articles and 2 books in her field of expertise. She's testified before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and is regularly featured in major domestic and international media. She's also worked as a Latin America and China analyst for the Department of Defense, as a senior China analyst for Science Applications International Corporation, as a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank. She's been a faculty member at Georgetown University, and bringing it closer to home for us, for Fauquier County, Virginia, where she developed the county's Mandarin language program. Ms. Myers holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and has done graduate work at George Washington University, Johns Hopkins, and Nanjing University, and Zhejiang University of Technology. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is the recipient of a Freeman Fellowship and a Fulbright Specialist Grant. In short, we're very pleased and honored that she's able to join us today. We've really lucked out on our speaker. So Ms. Myers, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for the very kind introduction. And it's really quite an honor to be here with you all too. I mean, when I do these discussions, I often learn more from the participants than I think I often convey. So it's really quite an opportunity for me as well. And I know so many of you are, you know, very, very well versed in a wide range of these topics and have had you know, illustrious careers of your own. And I hope you will, you know, indeed share a lot of your experiences as concerns China or Latin America or the nexus between the two as we engage in discussion after my presentation. What I tend to do typically, you know, or have done in previous discussions about the paper that I wrote, was to sort of summarize some of the main points, including an overview of the various phases of China-Latin America relations, really sort of that we've seen since the late 1990s, more or less. But right now we're at a really very different moment in the China-Latin, I mean, globally, right, certainly, but in the China-Latin America relationship as well. And I think we're entering an entirely new phase. So what I propose to do today is to provide you with a sort of hyper condensed, right, version of my usual talk, and then spend the bulk of my time, and I'll try and keep everything very short so we can have mostly a discussion, but the bulk of my time sort of looking in depth at what is happening now in this current phase of the relationship and what we might expect in the coming months and years as concerns Chinese engagement with Latin America, but the Western Hemisphere more broadly. So let's go to, I'm going to share my screen so that we can dive into these phases, many of which were highlighted in the paper itself, but just to give you a little bit more of a sense of how I classify this. Oh, my screen sharing is disabled. Would it be possible to make me a co-host?
Let me see what I can do. Let me see here.
Yes, there we go. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. So first things first, right? As I had mentioned, you know, the China-Latin America relationship really got going in the late 1990s, and it's one of, unsurprisingly, I think, especially for those of you who follow anything China related, right? It was one of the more recent relationships to be established, really sort of, you know, with the China-Africa relations predating China-Latin America relations by about a decade. And of course, relations closer
Michelle,
to home have really been far more extensive.
For a second, I just have to go to the restroom.
So let me start with
I'll be back in like 3-4 minutes. It's all set up.
In the early 1990s, or all of this was sort of predated, right, by economic and political ties early in the 20th century and even before in certain cases, right? We saw a lot of engagement by Chinese actors in Latin America, primarily in the political space, early in the 20th century and even earlier than that in the commercial realm in certain countries, right? But the China-Latin America relationship as we know it today really began in earnest in the late 1990s when China's national oil companies, in particular companies like CNPC or CNOOC, state-owned mining companies, and a few others entered the region. These companies were driven by a range of factors, including China's diplomatic competition with Taiwan. That was a major motivating factor for and has been for a number of decades now. But a major other driving force was what's called the going out strategy, which encouraged Chinese companies to go out to achieve 3 primary objectives. Those objectives were to acquire natural resources, to develop new export markets supportive of China's growing export sector, so looking for large export markets in Latin America and a wide range of other regions for what at that time at least were rather low value added goods. The range of goods that China is producing now have of course become increasingly high value added and high tech. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And then a third objective, one of the third tenets, or the third tenet of the going out strategy, was to internationalize Chinese companies, to make them more competitive with their international peers. And though it began in the late 1990s, this relationship, this initial relationship, really took off post 2008, after the global financial crisis, as a result of both trade-related and investment-related opportunities afforded by the crisis, as major economic partners sort of exited the region, companies sought to sell off their ailing assets, and China seized that moment, using a lot of its foreign reserves to support those endeavors. So that's largely, that's as I see it of the relationship, and nevertheless, those are sort of the main points, the main thrust of engagement at that point in time. Then we move on to 2013, and a number of very critical things obviously happened in 2013. I tend to argue that this is a new phase, right, in the relationship, because, well, first of all, Xi Jinping sort of assumed the helm. And when he did, he introduced not only a more extensive foreign policy agenda, right, but a very extensive domestic reform agenda, which, among other things, called for China to reform its state-owned sector, to streamline state-owned enterprise operations, to address pervasive all of these things because they're very directly related to what is going to end up happening and is happening right now in Latin America. Some other things that this reform agenda promoted included renminbi internationalization of China's currency as part of a broader set of financial reforms, the efforts to increase domestic and global opportunities for Chinese companies, boosting overall employment, investing foreign reserves at higher rates of return, and indeed improving China's overall soft power in the developing and developed world. And all of this is an effort, to achieve obviously a lot overseas and at home, but to ensure, more importantly, sort of sustainable rates of economic growth well into the future. Though related to China's own growth objectives, the elements of China's reform agenda, which were introduced, in 2013 during the third plenum by Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders, really drove so much of China's overseas lending and investment during this particular phase. And what you see here, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit difficult to see on this slide, but this is a map that we put together documenting planned and completed transport infrastructure projects from 2002 to 2018. These are projects that China has expressed interest in during that time period. The dark blue projects are projects that are completed or else are in some phase of construction. There is a shovel in the ground, in other words. The light blue projects are projects that, are in some phase of development. Maybe there's a memorandum of understanding. Maybe there's a sort of feasibility study ongoing where there's just, some mention of interest in eventually investing in this project. This really needs to be updated quite significantly. Quite considerably, rather. There are a lot of new projects that have been announced and others that have fallen through entirely, but this will give you a general sense of kind of the types of transport infrastructure. There are many other sorts of infrastructure projects, energy in particular, that are being developed around the region. But the sense of transport infrastructure engagement during this period and frankly, there's quite a bit, right? And the most extensive sort of projects, it's very difficult to see, but the most activity that we see in terms of actual, construction and operation is in the port sector. And you can see little blue dots sort of all over the region, including the Caribbean, indicating the construction of or operation of ports by Chinese companies. But what I mean by this, and I want to just demonstrate here how China's domestic reform efforts are related to its overseas investment. And so what I'd like to do, you can see my cursor, is just talk a little bit about this light blue rail project right here, which if any of you follow Peru or Brazil particularly closely may already know about this, but it's called the Bioceanic Railway. There are other transcontinental railway is another term, or Peru-Brazil Railway. These are all terms that have been used to describe this particular project. It's one that China expressed interest in way back in 2015 when Xi Jinping visited the region, and has in some form or another expressed interest in continuing to invest in or to promote, right, for a number of years now, despite, political, environmental, engineering related and other challenges associated with making this thing actually happen. So why is China interested in this particular project? Well, frankly, I think it's because for a range of reasons, obviously, but many of these reasons support China's own domestic reform objectives. So, for example, this is a project that would cost about $50 billion to complete. It would run from a port in Peru to a port in Brazil. This is one of 3 routes that's been proposed. And what it does, I think most importantly, is to transport soy from the Mato Grosso region in Brazil to the Peruvian coast, to transport across the Pacific. Why across the Pacific? Because if you go this way, rather than across the Atlantic, and any possible flashpoints in South China Sea. So the Pacific route is considered to be a more secure one, broadly speaking, in China's transport security analysis. Beyond that, right, if this project were to be supported by China and Chinese finance, it would probably be backed by China Development Bank. And so there's the prospect that these reserves that China Development Bank would use would be put to better use with higher rates of return overseas than at home. That's tended to be the case for a lot of different projects. And so it's a more efficient application of China's reserves. Support from China Development Bank would also necessarily require the use of, as tends to be the case with a lot of CDB loans, right? The use of Chinese equipment, so helps to facilitate high-tech exports in the construction of this rail, and also Chinese companies. So again, a sort of employment boosting measure. Sometimes these loans are also denominated in Chinese currency. So there's an element of renminbi internationalization to projects of this sort as well. And, the use of Chinese steel in particular, Chinese materials like steel, helps to address some of the problems that China has with overcapacity in some of its state-owned sectors, steel being one of those, right? So that is to say that, infrastructure is of interest, not just because it's part of the Belt and Road necessarily, but to support a wide range of objectives that are really pertinent to China's own growth objectives at home. And in addition to all of this, if China were able to make this happen, to make this railway happen, it could be a tremendous boost to China's overall image as one of the few, or if only companies that's been able to achieve this sort of cross-regional infrastructure development. That said, a lot could go wrong in this process as well, and certainly has for a lot of Chinese infrastructure projects in the region. So it's a hugely risky endeavor, nevertheless. So that brings us to phase, actually, I'm going to move beyond this. Actually, let me just talk about phase 3 very quickly. Phase 3 of the relationship really, I think, corresponds with the region's inclusion in the Belt and Road Initiative more than anything else. And for those that aren't familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm happy to talk about that in any depth in the Q&A. But, the Belt and Road Initiative just very basically was not a Latin America related initiative at the onset. It was sort of a reframing of the Silk Road, right, as initially conceived, and was focused on the Asian region. But it's become global over time, extended really to every region in the world, including the Arctic. And the very last region to be included formally was the Latin American and Caribbean region in 2018. And that kind of, is the beginning of what I believe is a sort of third phase in this relationship. This relationship is very similar to, I think, the second phase the third phase is similar to the second phase, and all are related to the first phase, because indeed there continues to be a promotion of these tenets of the going out strategy even today. So there's plenty of overlap across these phases. But what's different in this third phase, in addition to sort of the formalization of the Belt and Road Initiative, is that there is a much more extensive focus now on two elements of the Belt and Road Initiative, one being the health Silk Road. And that's not just a COVID-19 thing, but something we've seen, sort of ongoing for a couple of years now. And also, I think much more importantly, the digital Silk Road. So China's activity in the digital space, in technology, ICT in particular, is really quite pervasive in the region and evident in almost every country at this point in time. And I can talk in some depth about that too in later on in Q&A. In addition to this, we've seen a real proliferation of Chinese actors in the region really since 2018 related to the Belt and Road and a push for people-to-people connectivity. So not just, diplomatic actors as we might conceive of them from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and working through embassies, for example, but a really wide range of quasi-diplomatic actors. And those include, institutions that have been developed for that purpose, such as the Chinese Council for Promotion of Investment and Trade, or a wide range of other institutions that work with overseas Chinese communities, to, think tanks, friendship groups, all sorts of other actors that are doing a lot of engagement across the region to boost China's image and shape the external environment for China to advance certain objectives. So this has really become much, much more extensive, this activity, since 2018. And then also now, more than before, we've seen, well, that's not more than before, but for a long time, for about 10 years, we didn't see much activity in the Taiwan realm. And I can talk about that, why that might be if you'd like. But since 2017, and then again in 2018, we saw a lot of competition between China and Taiwan, and we saw three countries in particular cut ties with Taiwan in the region. So Taiwan, just for those who don't know, the Latin American and Caribbean region has historically been a stronghold for Taiwan, with quite a few countries still, maintaining diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But Taiwan lost three of its main allies in the region just since 2017. The first of those was Panama, which cut ties in 2017, followed by the Dominican Republic in 2018, and then El Salvador in 2018. Each of these decisions, right, sort of prompted a different sort of response from the US government. But in any case, the sense is that at the moment there's been sort of a pause in this activity. There hasn't been a domino effect, right, that many have projected, largely because of US pressure. But the general sense, I think, among a lot of countries, and including some analysts in Taiwan, is that it's only a matter of time before some of these remaining allies also cut ties with Taiwan in favor of establishing them with China. So let's now, and these are some of the projects that were negotiated with Panama. I won't go into them in any depth in the interest of time, but after that country decided to cut ties with Taiwan in 2017. So there was indeed an effort to reward Panama for that decision. However, a few of these deals have fallen through as a result of corruption allegations since 2017. So what's happening now? A whole lot of new stuff is the short answer. So I think the overarching, as we look, question here is, and especially for Latin Americans as they view China, is whether China will come to the rescue of an ailing Latin America in any clear way in the coming months and years, as it sort of did, frankly, after the 2008 global financial crisis, as I mentioned, right? When China's trade doubled with the region after 2008, investment also surged, especially acquisitions of ailing assets. Will this happen again? Is what a lot of sort of, groups, constituents, Latin American citizens are asking, especially as they struggle with their own economic challenges. And to answer this, I think we need to think about a few different factors that are either supporting, limiting, or otherwise shaping China's engagement at this point in the relationship. These include, first of all, the extent and speed of China's recovery, right, which has global implications, but also the nature, very importantly, of China's stimulus measures and related reforms. It also includes what the Latin American investment environment will look like right, post-COVID-19. And when all is said and done, in terms of economic policy in response to COVID-19. Will we see a resurgence of China's appetite for high-risk strategic investment in ailing sectors in Latin America and in the Caribbean in the coming months or not? That's a huge point of debate in sort of the China-Latin America community at the moment, right? China's overseas financing outlook and the country's thoughts on debt relief will also have major implications for the nature of the relationship in the coming months and years. And many other factors will also, which we won't have time to address today in any sufficient depth, will also have a major effect on the relationship, including, of course, China's overseas medical assistance, which has been quite extensive, and its effect on overall views of China in the region. So first of all, on these first couple of points, just as was the case in the second described, China's overseas engagement will depend on the various stimulus measures, on the various economic currently putting in place. These are critical for China's growth, first of all, right, which has implications for the health of the global economy. But the companies that fare best in China's recovery, that are prioritized by China's stimulus, will also be among those that are best positioned to invest abroad in the coming years. And I think it very likely that we're going to see some new national champions, right, resulting from a lot of China's stimulus measures, from these infusions of capital in certain very specific and strategic sectors. And those sectors include things like that are called new infrastructure, right, in China. So things like 5G, telecommunications, smart cities, and other AI-enabled technologies, automation, electricity transmission. And it's not just Huawei, a Chinese telecoms company that we hear a lot about here in the United States, but a wide range of other actors that are going to be benefiting in some form from the sort of infusion of capital related to China's own recovery. And, Chinese innovations in these areas at home, right, or Chinese work by to eventually transcend China's borders, as it already has to, a considerable degree, with a range of implications, some positive, some possibly negative, for the region, depending upon, the sort of goods and services that we're talking about. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, this is not something I'm making up, but rather that we see, this is a quote from Xie Fujian, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences president. He says, the pandemic has had a heavy effect on traditional industries, but it's also accelerated the application of new technologies, such as many of the ones that I mentioned. Big data is a huge area of cooperation between China and certain places in Chile and Argentina, for example, right now, and creating opportunities for innovative emerging industries to expand to countries and regions along the Belt and Road, which, as I said, is now really just a global phenomenon. A second point, so much in the relationship also depends on the investment environment in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin American and Caribbean countries, in the aftermath of COVID-19. China signed a record number, as you can see here in 29, there was a record number of greenfield investment deals that were signed that year, many of them large-scale infrastructure projects, such as the Chancay port in Peru, for example. But what metrics, right, will Chinese companies use to measure the viability of proposed infrastructure and other projects in the coming months and years? The situation isn't looking particularly rosy from an economic perspective in Latin America, right? And then there's a lot of political risk that is in fact mounting in some countries. We've seen what's been happening in Peru of late, a lot of political risk in other countries as well. And so will these proposed projects, these promises actually come to pass? Perhaps. There is still activity in Latin America. We've seen some new investment in expansion of mining assets. We've seen some new projects in Chile, especially in the lithium sector. First ever mining project in Colombia, gold mining project was just signed. So things are happening, right? But will these big infrastructure projects, where a lot of the ones that were proposed in some of these countries in 2019 actually come to? There are also questions about whether Chinese credit, Chinese loans, can be accounted on as a silver bullet to help Latin American governments manage the economic fallout of the outbreak. Ecuador, Argentina, and Venezuela have received some assistance from China just over the past few months. Forgiveness of not a whole lot in the way of forgiveness of debt, right? But some no interest credit lines and extension of debt payments, a couple of new loans to Ecuador, things of that nature. We've seen materialize. So there is some new lending to help some of these countries to navigate the COVID-19 crisis. That said, China does not appear to be prepared to provide some of, the same sort of level of finance, and many would deem that to be a good thing. Others are very concerned about this, in that we've seen in the past. And was sort of the peak of Chinese state finance to Latin America, with about 35 billion being issued to Latin American governments and state-owned enterprises at that point in time. But since 2015, really, we've seen a rather steep decline in Chinese state-to-state finance to Latin America. And in 2020, we expect this to increase slightly, but just to about 2.4 billion. So just a slight uptick in what we've seen. The trend is a downward trend, and we just aren't seeing the same sort of lending that we've seen in the past. The same is true in terms of investment. Broadly speaking, we saw that surge in greenfield investment that I showed on the other slide, but mergers and acquisitions are falling. And the global trend is really a sort of overall decline in Chinese FDI, despite the fact that the Belt and Road is indeed promoting of more in the way of overseas global investment. Whether, greenfield JVs, mergers and acquisitions, you name it. Here, just for your own reference, is some information on who in the past has received the bulk of Chinese finance from the Chinese policy banks, right? China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. And you can see really that it's Venezuela above, far and ahead, right? It has been the main recipient of Chinese finance to the tune of about 62 billion. About 20 billion of that is still outstanding. Brazil has paid off almost all of its debt. Ecuador, a fair amount remains to be paid off. In Argentina, still there is about, I think it's 5 for Argentina, although I'd have to recheck those figures. And finally, and this is just a terrible slide, so I apologize for this, but the point of it is not for you to see necessarily the words, but to demonstrate the range of activity that we saw in terms of so-called mask diplomacy from China, right, since in the midst of COVID-19. The US also has been very, very active in supplying things like ventilators and other PPE to countries in Latin America, but China has been active really in nearly every country in the region and to varying degrees. This activity is just from March to June. And then there's been, continuous activity since then, from June to now, by Chinese companies, by Chinese, the Chinese Red Cross, the Chinese government, certain provincial and state and rather municipal governments have also been active in this space. Here I'd include, and this includes to Taiwan's allies, right? Not just to countries that recognize China specifically. It's unclear to me to what extent any of this is having a major impact on views of China, but certainly there are concerted efforts, whether through mass diplomacy or a wide range of other forms of diplomatic outreach, to shape views of China to ensure whether is viewed positively, and to try to ensure, that these countries end up understanding, first of all, China's positions on Taiwan and a range of other policy matters, but also ideally support them. And those, we can talk in some depth about what those look like if you'd like later on. In addition to all of this, and I haven't addressed this at all, right, is the sort of broader US-China Latin America triangular dynamic, which of course has had a major effect on decision-making among Latin American governments and Caribbean governments, but also I think in some ways has shaped the sort of engagement that we're seeing China do in the region, or in the ways in which they are carrying that out. Brazil is a really fascinating case study there, as is Chile, where we've seen, really rather extensive intervention in decision making on specific tech related deals in particular. And I'll stop there since I've gone way over, I think, my allocated time, and I'd very much look forward to your questions.
Margaret, thank you. Thank you very, very much for the very lucid and thorough and wide-ranging explanation that you've given us. You've covered a lot of ground very quickly, and I'm grateful for that. I'll claim the privilege of asking the first question. Of course, prior to the session today, I read the article that you wrote, and then I viewed the Foreign Policy Association's video. And I was getting deeper and deeper into your article. The thought occurred to me that James Monroe must be rolling over in his grave, given the amount of influence and presence that China has now established south of us. And then I was struck in the video by the statement of our former Secretary of State, John Kerry, saying the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. And then shortly, a few years later, comes John Bolton saying the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.
Right.
Well, we certainly haven't seen armadas of Chinese gunships coming over the horizon yet, which I think the Monroe Doctrine was mainly conceived to thwart back in the early 19th century. But how do you think the U.S. overall has been reacting to this extreme amount of activity of China over the last 20 years to the south of us? And it also calls to mind a statement that our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, made last year. He was addressing a group, and he said that our main concern is to see that China retains only its proper place in the world. I'm certain a statement that China can only take as being extremely condescending. Right. So how does China react to that, and how do we get on with them to make certain that everybody's interests are looked after in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I mean, it's no surprise, obviously, it wouldn't be to anyone I'm here that the U.S.-China relationship, broadly speaking, has deteriorated rather considerably, and that a lot of focus is being placed on monitoring and aiming to shape Chinese engagement with the developed and developing world alike, focused on a range of different sectors, with tech in particular being an area of particular contention. But I would say, just as a sort of historical, to add a bit of historical perspective here, that this is not a Trump administration phenomenon, right? There has been a growing concern about China's engagement globally, and to engage in very strategic sectors for a number of years now, certainly within the Obama administration, also under Bush. And a lot of this started when Hutchinson Whampoa, which is frankly a Hong Kong company, right, invested in the Panama Canal a number of years ago. I think it was the 1990s or early 2000s deal. And since then, there's been a very conscientious effort to monitor what precisely China is doing in the region. That said, different administrations have taken very different approaches to dealing with this, right? I think, what the Obama administration sought to do, although they never used or tried to refrain from the word containment, right, was to work very extensively with allies to establish and reinforce a rules-based trade and other mechanisms to ensure and try to at least influence Chinese decision making as concerns, especially trade-related matters, but also ability to influence existing systems of global governance, and that that approach was quickly dismantled when the Trump administration took office. Now we have a very different, a very, very different philosophy. A really interesting, I don't know if any of you all heard this, but it was an interview on NPR just a couple of days ago with a few different experts on China, many of whom suggested that the Trump administration has indeed diagnosed the problem accurately, that so much of this competition at present, or these tensions, are based, frankly, on growing competition in the tech sector in particular, and a very clear sense that the U.S. is falling behind China at a rapid rate, and at this point, runs the risk of not being able to catch up. And that, a lot needs to be done to ensure that the U.S. remains competitive in these areas. What the Trump administration has done, in addition to sort of these punitive trade measures, right, has been to try to use whatever influence we have in the Latin American and Caribbean region, and then much of the rest of the world, to ensure that other countries do not adopt Chinese technologies or do not work with China in certain areas that, the US in particular, but others have deemed to be problematic. I don't think that a Biden administration would take precisely the same approach, although I do think there would be, very similar concerns about the type of activity that China is carrying out in the Latin American and Caribbean region. What has happened, I think, as an unintended consequence of all of this is that, the US we have significantly weakened, I think, a lot of our relationships with Latin American countries. The trust that has been established over years and years, right, with with allies like Colombia, with partners like Chile, and asked really rather a lot of them, often, to their own detriment from an economic perspective. It may very well be that that working with Huawei is problematic and can lead to real security related challenges and issues, data privacy problems, data sovereignty issues, right? It may very well be the case, but the issues that these countries are struggling with existential, I think, in terms of actual economic viability, extremely challenging development issues. And so for them, taking deals off the table is just not something that's going to be sustainable in the longer term, whether it's a Chinese deal or a deal from anyone else. And so I think there's it will be interesting to see what a Biden administration would do differently. But I know that there is, I think, a lot of agreement across the board from on both sides of the aisle, right, within Congress, but also among Chinese analysts that are aligned with either the Trump administration or the Biden administration, about the need to build capacity globally in developing countries to be able to strike good deals, not just with China, but with anyone who happens to be approaching these countries with infrastructure proposals and infrastructure finance. And that strikes me, broadly speaking, can certainly be politicized, right, this sort of work, but it strikes me as maybe a more constructive approach to a lot of this, is to ensure that these countries have the tools in place, the mechanisms in place, and the sorts of institutions to be able to monitor and carry these projects out in a good way.
Healthy, constructive competition.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we have a question, Ms. Myers, from Warren Milberg, one of our participants. Would you like to go, Warren?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation today. I found it very interesting. The question I have is, when various Latin American and Caribbean nations establish relationships with China, that heretofore had relationships with Taiwan, is that a zero-sum game? I mean, where you can only have relationships with one country and not the other, or can they coexist?
Was it, there was one break in your sentence. Was it that they had previously had them with Taiwan?
Yes.
And then, yeah. No, they can only choose one or the other. When they, the one China policy, right, which is promoted by mainland China, by the People's Republic of China, or else to, make the case that Taiwan is an independent nation, is the official representative of China. So, I mean, they're really two very conflicting narratives, right, or approaches. And so, yes, they have to choose one or the other. And right now, gosh, it may done a count recently that's still in the Latin American and Caribbean region that still maintain diplomatic ties to Taiwan as opposed to China. One of those, almost all of them are in Central America or the Caribbean. The one that isn't is Paraguay.
We have a question, Ms. Myers, from Stephen Reardon. Stephen, would you like to talk? Let me see if I can find him here.
Yes. How extensive has Chinese military involvement in Latin America been over the last 20 years? Has it been growing?
It's definitely been growing. I mean, it depends kind of on on what element of this military engagement we want to
talk about. Military assistance or security assistance.
Growing quite significantly, yeah. I mean, arms sales are they're there, right? But they're pretty limited in comparison to what we see from Russia or from the U.S., for example. But yes, military assistance, sort of military training opportunities, things of this nature have been growing quite significantly with, essentially new partnerships being developed that are region-wide. So at one time, there was more of a focus on some of these original the stronger allies that China had established early on in this enhanced relationship: Venezuela, Bolivia, other Argentina to a degree, Cuba certainly, but now really there's a lot of exchange and assistance across the board in a wide range of countries, with military personnel going to China for training, with Chinese personnel coming to Latin America to do various. Less obvious are sort of major exercises or large scale assistance see the U.S. doing through what we used to be Partnership of, I don't know if Partnership of the Americas is still around or not, I can't recall, but a lot of these sort of initiatives that we've seen, medical hospital ships and other different countries in the region to provide assistance. We don't see that same level, although there are a couple of examples of, especially a hospital ship called the Peace Ark, transiting around the Caribbean and heading to Venezuela and stopping in ports around the region to do things of that nature.
Picking up on that, Margaret, China has established its first ever military base abroad in Djibouti in the last couple of years. I take it there's no intention to do likewise in Latin America, at least at the present time?
Right. I mean, I think within the Department of Defense, there's a lot of concern that might be something that may happen, especially with respect to a lot of these port acquisitions. And so I think there's been a real concerted effort to analyze a lot of these acquisitions to determine just how deep water some of these ports are and whether they can be used, they have a dual use, or could, potentially in the future in the event of some sort of military contingency. Yeah, as of now, there's no clear indication that that's on the horizon.
Okay, we have a question from Mr. Plum. Larry Plum. So let me go ahead and mute him. Let's see here. And find him here.
All right, unmuted.
Yes, you're
Can you hear
unmuted.
me? Okay. You've sort of already answered my question to an extent, but if you were in charge of U.S. policy in this triangle of China, Latin America, U.S., what would you think, look in the next 5 years, what are the top 2 or 3 concerns that you think need to be addressed, and how would you propose that they ought to be addressed?
That's a hard one. I've been thinking a lot about this, frankly, and trying to actually come up with some sort of paper on the topic. For me personally, the thing that concerns me most about a lot of I don't worry about the debt issue, because and that's a big part of what we're hearing from a lot of U.S. officials right now, is that there's about debt trap diplomacy and the sort of predatory lending practices that that China is using across the region, and that is an issue in Africa. World. And to a degree, yes, I mean, Venezuela certainly could qualify as, as part of that. But for me, Venezuela, it's more of a creditor trap than a debt trap, right? In my view. And I think China very much regrets having, established such a significant presence there over the years, and did so, frankly, very accidentally. But, so that is the fact that a lot of this debt has already been paid off. What does worry me is the tech side of things. And I don't know, frankly, what the best I do know what the solution is, right? But it's a long-term solution, and that's investment, right? Investment in R&D and really trying to boost US prospects and US capacity in a lot of these areas, right? In order to be able to offer viable alternatives, or not just US ones, but working with partner nations to develop viable alternatives. And there are efforts to do that already, with Japan, for example, and these ORAN, these open, gosh, what are they called? Radio, I don't even know what it stands for, right? Networks, which are an alternative to some of the 5G technologies that China has been, or infrastructure rather, that China sells globally. But yeah, I mean, the tech stuff is deeply concerning to me. And by that, I mean mostly a lot of the surveillance tech stuff. And that's really wide ranging, right? It's not just cameras, it's all of the sort of 5G applications, right? The smart lighting, the this, that, and the other, where, there's just, if there are backdoors, if there is some sort of control over what can happen citywide, over these sort of wide-ranging systems, if there is an ability to gather data with or without people understanding it, or fully, or without any protections, no legislation in place, that is really deeply concerning across the board. And especially, I mean, I do worry very deeply also about what some of the surveillance stuff can mean for democratic principles and for democratic governance across the region. If these tools fall into the hands of of leaders with authoritarian inclinations, it can be very bad things for civil liberties in the region. And already we're seeing that happen, even in countries where they're saying it's not being used that way, like Ecuador, it's being used that way. There's a lot of evidence of that happening. So to monitor dissidents, to monitor political those from other political parties. So very, very concerning. So the long-term solution is to, is to try and ensure that somebody else is producing these technologies and can sell them, without ones that are indeed a threat to democracy, right? But the short-term solution is much more challenging. And I think, frankly, it's, again, a capacity building one. It's an effort to work sort of across the board to ensure that there's accountability. So building up the media presence, right, and understanding of these issues so that they can monitor things, building up civil society understanding of all of these issues. They're very technical, right, so that they can monitor these things. working with partner nations to ensure that they're bidding for these projects as well. You know, but it's a really, I mean, it's a really challenging thing to achieve, especially when China, you know, is there already and they offer really competitive pricing, sometimes, you know, subsidizing these things, and it all comes as a package deal. It's very easily implemented, and you know, why not, right? Is what a lot of these governments are thinking, and indeed prefer that model in any case. So I don't have a good solution there, and it's one that will require a lot of work by whatever administration. Other than that, I mean, I think for me personally, I you know, with my 2 small children, I worry deeply about the environmental implications of a lot of what China is doing in the region. And it's not as though China is, you know, necessarily worse behaving in a lot of these areas or in a lot of its projects. It's just that it's so heavily focused in the extractive sector and in large scale infrastructure. And these have outsized impacts on the environment, these particular projects. And so with very little regard for kind of, you know, there's regard for the compliance, you know, with environmental regulations specific to a project, but not for the overall effects environmentally on the region. And on the Amazon, for example, the effects of extensive soy trade and things of that nature, and very little recognition of all of that. And it has been rather devastating for certain communities so far. And then, you know, beyond that, I think that China is making a lot of progress at the local level in particular, but just kind of across the board through public diplomacy on pushing certain policies that, you know, aside from all of the tech stuff, are very much stand in great contrast to what the US and a lot of other sort of democratic nations have been promoting, whether in terms of internet governance, human rights, or on a wide range of other issues. And what we're seeing happening now, really for the first time in a long time, is an alignment by democratic countries in Latin America with Chinese decisions in the UN, right? Or Chinese positions in the UN. That wasn't the case for a very long time, but on Hong Kong in particular, that happened. And on some other human rights areas, it's starting to happen. Either they, you know, abstain, or they vote in favor of China. And this is something that is, I think, deeply concerning, because there are, of course, very clear divisions between what China is promoting and some of the US and other nations would hope to.
Thank you.
Margaret, picking up on that, in fact, in September of this year, the Trump administration announced a Western Hemisphere strategic framework. Do you know what that is and what does it entail?
So I haven't spoken to anyone in the Trump administration about it, but it strikes me as not being all that different from the Western Hemisphere policy sort of that was articulated a couple of years ago, right? It's sort of an extension of that, but with much more of a focus on China and Russia in particular, and on, you know, on the nefarious effects of or intentions that these countries may have in the Latin American and Caribbean region. There's a whole section on that, as opposed to sort of a fleeting reference to it. In addition, you know, it sort of outlines areas in which the Trump administration in particular intends to focus in the Latin American region, and they are very similar in nature to what we've seen in previous policy documents, whether Trump administration wins, Obama or otherwise, right? That's a focus on security, a focus on democracy, these sort of, you know, pillars of the U.S. Latin America relationship for many, many years. But I think, again, it's more the rhetoric, you know, is nothing new, but the ways in which these the Trump administration has gone about achieving these things has been really quite distinct from what we've seen in the past, in many, many ways, right? And so, yeah, it's not, and it incorporates, of course, you know, this America Crece, right, which is this whole government effort to invest more extensively in the region, you know, leveraging mostly private sector assets.
Thank you.
ask a question?
ahead,
Yes,
Mark.
excuse me, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Margaret. A couple questions. First of all, is the Chinese crackdown on Hong Kong, what has that had? Has that had any effect on the relationship with Latin America and these countries? And secondly, the tape talked about the issue of corruption in Latin America. How does the issue of corruption in Latin America and corruption in China factor into the relationship between China and Latin America? Is that a problem?
Those are great questions. So the Hong Kong thing is really very confusing to me because more than anything, you know, at least on the government level, and I think perhaps the most important thing here is to distinguish between Latin American governments and Latin American populations. Latin American governments have been very silent, very quiet about Hong Kong. And as I said, you know, in the human rights sort of council, or when was it? Gosh, I forget that what particular UN meeting it was where you know, the topic was discussed, but they either abstained from, or in the case of, you know, Suriname, Guyana, and a number of other countries, supported China's, you know, China's position on Hong Kong directly. And so, you know, really they're, despite, you know, many years and a long-standing historical focus on human rights in the Latin American and Caribbean region, there has not been an effort among Latin American and Caribbean governments to call out China on Hong Kong in particular, and to support any sort of, you know, democracy initiatives or those, you know, particular groups that are fighting for very different outcomes in Hong Kong. Among the population is a little bit different. I would say the vast majority of Latin Americans and Caribbeans are not tracking this at all, right? But for those who do, there's been a real, I forget who it was. Does anyone recall who the basketball player was who, US basketball player, right, who was dropped by China? But there was a US basketball player who made a very strong statement about Hong Kong, and, you know, faced consequences as a result of that, was dropped by some sort of Chinese company that had been sponsoring him. And that has attracted a lot of attention among a number of, you know, of Latin Americans in a range of countries who view that as, you know, an overreach of evidence of China, you know, not being accepting of a wide range of viewpoints, or, you know, of differing opinions, including among those that are outside of China, and it was rather damning, I think, for views of China among certain folks, you know. But these are people who really track a lot rather closely and carefully. And then on your second question with respect to corruption, I mean, in many ways, corruption has facilitated deal making, right? And it sort of greased the wheels for a lot of this stuff. And certainly, you know, China doesn't have an FCPA process. No, there's no issue in terms of, you know, providing bribes or major gifts or any of this. There are no restrictions for Chinese companies looking to do this. So, you know, more often than not, you hear about major delegations of local level officials, or, you know, Congress people, you know, parliamentarians, you know, heading to China, going on shopping sprees, coming home with bags and bags of Gucci and Prada items, you know, and then maybe you're striking a deal with China in 3 or 4 years. You know, this happens a lot. You know, so there is that element. I think, you know, there's a willingness on both sides to engage in activity that would be deemed corrupt by a lot of other investors or actors. On the other hand, you know, China has been burned on a couple of occasions by, you know, by deal allegations, right? So that happened in Mexico with the Querétaro Railway project, wherein Peña Nieto, you know, was sort of implicated, and there was, I don't fully understand what precisely happened, but there was enough corruption to derail the project entirely, and that caused a real rift, actually, in the Mexico-China relationship. Christina Kirchner had promoted a couple of, it was more of a patronage issue than anything else, right? But a few dams in her home province, wherein, you know, most of her friends sort of benefited from the economic transaction. And that deal, when Macri entered government and was the presidency, right, and was reviewing it, stalled for a period of about a year, and the Chinese company wasn't able to do anything or even pay its employees for about a year. Things are back on track sort of right now, but it's been a real challenge for them. So, you know, on the one hand, it's promoting of deal making. On the other hand, it's, you know, there are moments when things can really go wrong with respect to corruption allegations in particular.
Okay, we have a question, Margaret, from Rich Stana. So let me grab his microphone.
How's that? Good.
That sounds
Thanks
good.
for being good. Thanks for being with us today. I liked your article on the PwC movie. You know, it's true that China seems to not always do these foreign assistance projects sort of out of the goodness of their heart. They want something back. And we've seen that in Botswana with their customs and all. I want to take it to a different level, though, away from the 30,000 feet. I think you're right that we really gave up an advantage that we had in Latin America. I know in downtown Montevideo, there's a statue of FDR. I doubt if you'd see a statue of a US president, you know, in more modern times. I think I mentioned before, several things ago, that I was at a New Year's party in Iguazu, and they played songs from Mexico, and people went out and danced. They played songs from Uruguay and Argentina, and then they played New York, New York, and there was crickets. So it seems like, you know, the hearts and minds have been lost to some extent, but I don't know that the Chinese are necessarily picking up those hearts and minds. I know I've only been to Central and South America a handful of times, but when I see Chinese tourists, which is really where you get an idea of what Chinese culture is all about, they seem to be a little arrogant or heavy-handed. I don't know if it's a cultural thing, condescending toward locals, and you could tell it's not always appreciated. So to what extent do the Chinese, in addition to all these other things we're talking about, military, economic, you know, foreign assistance and all that, don't they have a ways to go to win the hearts and minds, not only in Latin America, but in the developed world? I know, you know, they don't do these foreign assistance. They'll extract the minerals, they'll extract the gold, and if it isn't there, you're gone.
And they bring their own workers in to do it, and their own machinery, and their own everything over there.
Who are similarly apart and aloof.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right. Certainly in terms of soft power, right? As, you know, Nye's version of soft power. There are a lot of different definitions, of course, but I mean, the US has still a clear advantage, even if we've lost some of that edge, right? As you mentioned already, Rich. And I mean, just there are so many personal linkages, right, between Americans and Latin Americans, so many cultural linkages. There is just, I think, a more similarity in terms of culture overall. There are, you know, shared interests in movies and music, and, you know, and these connections, even though they've been dwindling, I think, of programs and projects that the US has in place to engage more extensively in these areas have, you know, are still important, and those connections and those networks are still very much in place. But, you know, that said, I think that there's been real damage done overall to views of the US, both among, you know, regular citizens and also governments. And this is despite, and it's fascinating because it's despite the fact that indeed China's activity in Latin America is very transactional, right? And it's very opportunistic, right? And it's not based on a long-term interest in developing sort of, there is a very strong South-South narrative, and, you know, a lot of talk about cooperation and advancing common goals and things of this nature. But when you look at what's happening, it is indeed very transactional. And, But, you know, even so, I think, you know, we see in the Pew studies, right, and in other polling, that China, right, that may very well change in terms of views of the you know, China's or US benefit to the region. Whether that's accurate or not is another question entirely, but those are the viewpoints. And so what does one do about that? And I think so much of it has to do with framing, right, of our own policy, because China has come to the region with a message of cooperation. And whether it's, you know, cooperating or not, it matters not, because that message has resonated extensively with a lot of these populations. And it stands in contrast to some of the messaging that the US has been using. And at a time when really the region is looking for and in desperate need of cooperation in a wide range of sort of development enhancing areas. So yeah, I mean, but it's such a, I mean, you're exactly, I couldn't agree more on your point. And really the US ought to, you know, ought to have, I think, an advantage still in this area, given everything that you know, we have done together in terms of hemispheric agenda all of these years, but the past few years have been really quite unique.
Quite the diplomat saying it that way.
Margaret, I would say that we've had sort of a mixed history of our assistance to Latin America over the years. Of course, you had the good neighbor policy under FDR, and then the Alliance for Progress during the Kennedy administration. Even in terms of sheer numbers and investment and so forth, how do we compare today with China and what it is doing in Latin America?
I mean, in terms of numbers, you know, in terms of foreign direct investment, US FDI exceeds China's and is far more diversified. US trade sometimes does and sometimes does not exceed China's, depends on the country. China is a top trade partner for at least 3 countries in the region, right, depending upon how you classify it, and top export partner for far more. But yeah, I mean, our approach, frankly, I think it's one that needs to be revised. Certainly, we need to continue to focus on shared values, which is something that has been, you know, promoted by the Trump administration, certainly, but by many other administrations, and will likely be a feature of Biden administration policy toward the region. But we need to think a lot more extensively about crafting a policy with Latin American interests very much at the heart of what we're doing, and not just an imposition of some of these you know, features of policy features that we've had in place for many, many years. And we need to think about this while understanding what resonates, you know, in China's policy narrative toward China. Not to say that we should duplicate that in any way, but to understand why China has had such an advantage in the past, you know, 3 or 4 years, both in terms of perceptions and in terms of actual activity. And so, yeah, I mean, but in terms of, I mean, US activity in the region, certainly, I mean, when you look at the types of investment that companies are doing, the quality of investment, it's far superior. There are obviously there are examples of bad practices by every kind of company, right? And in some sectors, they're much more egregious than others, and the US does not always perform well. But many of the companies that are active in Latin America have worked very hard to uphold very high standards and to comply with the latest, you know, sort of CSR and other ESG requirements. And there is progress on that front among Chinese companies as well, but not nearly to the same degree.
Okay, we have a question from Petit Frères Woodson. Let me see, you're unmuted, so did you want to talk?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, before the question, I have a kind of a comment that links to the question. I was going to say that could we say that it's not just the US government only in terms of the policy that can help in the winning heart and minds? In the past, the US, I would say, companies were also, even though their decisions were driven by business decisions and profit, but they had a line or some pride in the US culture that helped them maintain a certain line and project the US culture in a better way than we see today, when they basically agnostic from a country-based perspective. And that tied to my question for the companies that are competing. I have personal experience in markets such as Africa or Latin America, where faced with the Chinese that have no limit in terms of how they operate, those people suddenly have constrained, hands tied because of the laws on our side, and suddenly they tend to try to distance themselves from their home country so they can, I would say, play with the same level playing field.
The US companies try and distance themselves, or other international companies?
US companies and other international companies.
Right, in order to compete more effectively.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's not one that, I mean, I've looked at in much depth, but certainly, I mean, you hear so many stories anecdotally about US companies just really not being able to compete on a level playing field with Chinese companies precisely because they don't have the same restrictions in place. And so, yeah, I mean, and it's exceedingly difficult. I mean, even if they try and just CPA or be caught up in some sort of investigation at some point down the road, right? Or may very well be an interesting venture with a local company or do something. I guess that's part of I think part of what a lot of embassies are trying to do right now is to ensure that the legislation, the regulations are in place in those countries where US companies are interested in investing to ensure that there is in fact a local playing field, there is sufficient transparency in procurement processes, that there are accountability measures, whether they are within the government, among regulatory institutions, or whether they are external in terms of media coverage or civil society activity or whatever it might be, right? And so that strikes me, it's a bit of an indirect, approach, but as one of the few things that, aside from, revising regulations here in the US to ensure a greater degree of competition overseas, is really all that can be done. And I certainly wouldn't suggest that we ought to lessen our focus on corruption at this particular moment, because certainly it's surging across the globe. So yeah, but I mean, it's such a great question. And I don't know, I wonder if you have any thoughts on ways in which these companies can compete more effectively, aside from trying to rework the framework to make it more of a level playing field.
I would say that maybe it's a question of what kind of lead time you're looking at. I'm thinking most of the time, those countries where US can try to help them put together some serious laws and structure against corruption. When you have a corrupted government in place, what the immediate result, they move into the Chinese umbrella. So at the end of the day, it's really a continuous show that freedom and the people can eventually get rid of those people and step back. There's no other way I can think of that we can force that. It's just a reality.
Right. To make sure. And yeah, I mean, and above all, transparency would appear to be the best way to achieve a lot of that, because certainly, deals have been taken down, right? Chinese deals have failed for a number of reasons. And a lot of that is because, of a lot of activity by civil society or by media that are highlighting, really corrupt activities or problematic projects that just haven't been vetted. They ought to have been. So I couldn't agree more.
And to finish, I would say the good news is that we see a huge, I would say, backfire reaction in Africa in general. So that tells us that transparency and truth can eventually win the day as we go.
Right. Right.
Okay. We have a question by Jane Lord. So let me see if I can bring her up.
Here I am.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead and start speaking, Jane.
I am. My question is, how have China's policies contributed to the destabilization of the populations in the countries they are assisting through their initiatives over the last 2 decades?
Well, I mean, I think it's a mixed record, right? In some we have to remember that China is an integral economic partner, right? Is a critical economic partner for much of the region right now. And there is evidence of China having helped, right, some of these populations through investments, and some of the better investments, right? Not all of them are horrific. There are a lot of problems with some of them. And, you know, through investment in sectors where nobody else, frankly, wants to invest, not because it's a bad project, but because there just isn't the financial incentive. Sometimes it's also a bad project, right? Which is troubling, but, you know, it really, the point is that there's a range of outcomes, but certainly there are, you know, there is evidence of destabilizing activity. And I mean, this is sort of, you know, broadly defined. So on the one hand, you see some destabilizing activity, for example, in mining community investments by Chinese companies in Peru, wherein, you know, there are supposed violations by Chinese companies, and you see local communities who are often actually doing the mining protesting, and a lot of sort of violent eruptions, some deaths, things of that nature, and destabilization because these projects are put on hold for a number of years or months, and, you know, it affects income and the well-being of these populations. This is not an exclusively China problem, of course, but, you know, in the Peru case, the Chinese companies have had the bulk of problems sort of late in the past few years. I mean, the worst case is Venezuela. I mean, without a doubt, right? Where nor is Venezuela just a China problem, but certainly, you know, Chinese finance to Venezuela, which as I demonstrated has been extensive, right, over the past few years, has really contributed to the Maduro, first the Chavez government, and then the Maduro's government's ability to sort of keep it chugging along, right, and to continue to make ill-advised policy decisions with respect to the economy, to governance, and in a wide range of different areas, all with really negative and really tragic implications for the Venezuelan population. And now, you know, with implications for a wide range of neighboring countries, as there is a mass migration out of Venezuela. And you know, it really is a sort of last result for these people who are suffering so deeply. And that is perhaps the most, you know, prominent example of destabilization related to Chinese activity in the region. Other than that, I mean, I think there are probably some other prominent examples too, but, you know, Venezuela really stands out.
Okay, I'm looking for any additional questions. Does anyone want to pose a question to Ms. Myers?
These are all really terrific questions.
Margaret, earlier I'd spoken to the possibility of the China establishing a military base in Latin America somewhere, probably a port.
Right.
And of course they haven't yet, and perhaps never will. But I was struck in the video that we watched that it mentioned a Chinese space station in Argentina, right. And it really didn't go into any great depth as to what exactly that's being used for. And I also, the comment of one of the local residents saying, you know, you don't need that many men there to take a look at the moon. So what gives with that particular space station, and are others perhaps on the way?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different perspectives on this space station, right? One view, in one sort of perspective, it's viewed as a real threat of an example of China leveraging sort of friendly relations with Argentina at the time, right? And still, I guess it's a pretty friendly relationship to establish a military presence under the auspices of state, or rather of deep space observation, right, in Argentina, with obviously an interest in deep space observation, but also in observing some of what others in the Western Hemisphere, including the US, might be doing in outer space, right? And so there's that viewpoint. There is another viewpoint, and frankly, I haven't studied this enough to know where I would fall on this, right? But that this is a natural progression for China. China is a major economic power. It has been looking for a very long time and in the process of developing its own space program. And part of having a space program is having a deep observation facility in different parts of the world, including in the Southern Hemisphere. And a place like Neuquén in Argentina is sort of ideal for that. In Chile, in a sort of very similar area, in terms of geography, there are other observational facilities for other countries. These are generally shared facilities. So you have a number of different countries sort of operating the Deep Space Research Facility together, which is very different from China's, which, like most things that China does, is sort of shrouded in secrecy, which is part of the problem, right? Maybe if they were a bit more open about it, people wouldn't be so suspicious. But nevertheless, there's a sense that, okay, this is not such an abnormal thing to do if you want to have deep space observation capacity, is to put a space station in this particular locale to be able to do that. And so they are not doing that, however, in cooperation with Argentina as they sort of purport to be. It's mostly a sort of PLA, meaning Chinese military staffed, installation. And so, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of concern about it for that reason in any case. But yeah, whether it's a natural progression of things or not is I think, a point of debate.
Do we
Any
have
more
anyone
questions,
else?
David?
I don't see anything at the moment. Let
me ask one more question, and this may be thrust into the future. But Margaret, if you were invited by the incoming Biden administration to give them some advice on what they should do in regard to China and Latin America, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to start by rebuilding our standing in the Latin American region through targeted investment, through a much more cooperative policy, at least in terms of, rhetoric. I mean, and also practically speaking. I would advise a continuation of Trump administration policy in terms of capacity building at the local level, both in, establishing, transparency, promoting initiatives, policy coordination on things like data sovereignty and data security, all of these capacity building efforts that would be really critical for these countries, whether or not they decide to partner with China. I would rejoin the TPP immediately because there's if working to ensure that China complies with international standards, whether on trade or in other areas, investment, leveling the playing field for overseas investment, the TPP was very well equipped to do that. And China worried deeply about the TPP for that very reason. Whether the TPP will be as effective now that the RCEP, its sort of China-backed competitor, has been passed is another question. But I still think that would be a really, really important move. I think that, another way to convince China to adopt certain measures that may help to level the playing field, so to speak, is to use the tariffs that are already in place, even though they're not something I think that Biden supports in theory. They're already in place to use those and to peel them back conditionally as China adopts certain structural reforms that will be ideally promoting of more opportunity for U.S. companies in China, but also a more level playing field globally. And I mean, I think there are a wide range of other sort of U.S.-based policies that need to be implemented to improve U.S. competitiveness in these sectors where we have been sort of resting on our laurels for a little bit too long, assuming that we are going to be dominant for a number of years. And in fact, we've fallen behind very quickly in some very critical areas. That's not to say that that's the case everywhere, but in a lot of this tech stuff, it's really quite astonishing the rate at which China has advanced. And of course, they have some conditions that help to promote all of that other countries do not. But nevertheless, I think a lot needs to be done to get us back in a much more competitive place. But that's just a part of it, and obviously not particularly well thought through. So there's a lot more, I think, to think about. I'd be interested in your thoughts on all of this. I mean, you all have so much experience. What you think might be helpful?
Well, it would seem to me that China's primary interest in Central and Latin America is economic, establishing trade relationships, especially extractive materials. I think that's what they're really after.
Yeah, I think you're right too. I mean, I think that's absolutely accurate, that so much has been based on their own food and security calculus, right? Energy security calculus and ability to advance in terms of infrastructure growth and related resource acquisition. But I think it's also a markets thing, right? And promoting whatever sort of exports are needed to grow certain industries, strategic industries, to ensure that they can avoid the middle income trap. Yeah.
Do we have any additional questions? I'm spanning the list. Let me see if I can find any. Mike, did you want to say anything?
No, if we don't have any additional questions, maybe Margaret, you'd like to leave us with some parting thoughts, and we would certainly like to leave you with our very best wishes and our sincere thanks for giving so liberally of your time today. It's been most enlightening, and we're much in your debt.
Well, no, thank you all so much for, I don't know that I have anything more to say about China and Latin America. Certainly, these have been exhaustive questions, and really, I mean, excellent ones that challenged me to think in even much, greater depth about a lot of the points that I've made in discussions of late. But so I thank you for that, for the challenge and for the very kind invitation and for sticking it out all of this time. I'm sure you're all suffering from Zoom fatigue as everyone else is. So it's tremendous sort of virtually meeting you all, and I'm deeply grateful for the very kind invitation.
Oh, thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, best wishes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Margaret.